Welcome to Chapter 7, Managing Human Resources. There is a lot to unpack in this chapter, but listen, it's going to give you a new appreciation of what the Human Resources Department goes through and the scope of their responsibility because there is a lot to keep track of and there's very specific procedures they need to follow. And let's face it, managing the human resources, the human capital in an organization, the people who work there, is the most valuable asset for that company or corporation. Without the people, what do you have? And the higher quality people you have, generally the more successful the organization is. So this human resources chapter is super important. It is a building block of any organization and so important to know as a manager the ins and outs of how human resources work. So having said that, let's jump in. So these are the learning outcomes, pretty straightforward. Describe the legal framework of human resources management in Canada and why effectively managing diversity is good for business. So there's a couple things to unpack here. One, that there are legal frameworks involved in managing human resources in Canada. So there's laws that you need to follow when you are dealing with employees. And secondly, and this is also really critical, managing diversity. Canada is one of the most diverse countries out there. So if you're not effective at managing diversity, it's really hard to have a good business. Number two, explain why strategic human resource management and human resource planning can help an organization gain a competitive edge. Absolutely. If you're better at managing resources, hiring the top talent, you're going to be the best organization out there. So this is a critical step in being an effective human resource management department. Describe the 5 components of human resource management and explain how each of them fit together with the strategy and structure of an organization. We will unpack that one a little bit further. Explain the role of human resource management in dealing with workplace harassment. Also something that has legal ramifications and very specific steps to follow here in Canada. Okay, so strategic human resource management. Human resource management are the activities that managers engage to attract and retain employees and to assure that they perform at a high level and contribute to accomplishing the organizational goals. So you can see how with the diagram, it is a bit of a circle, a bit of a continuum, right? The 5 major components, you first of all have to recruit and select the best people for the job. But that's not enough. You need to train them and make sure that they continue to receive professional development so they can work effectively in the organization. You need to provide people with performance appraisals and feedback. How am I doing? Am I doing well? Am I struggling? In what areas can I improve? All of this information is critically important for employees to perform at that high level that we all want them to. We need to make sure that our pay and benefits is competitive within the industry, that we're compensating people in a way that is fair and equitable, in a way that if they left our organization, maybe they would be compensated in a similar way. We don't want to lose the high level of employees to other organizations because they have a better pay and benefits package. And then the last one is employee engagement. People want to be involved in their organization. They want to feel that they're a part of it. So we want to make sure they are kept in the loop, that they are engaged in the process. And then that goes back to recruitment and selection. If we have a very highly engaged employee pool, we have people there that love being there and they want to be involved. Maybe they help us fill vacancies as they come along because they're going to tell other friends, listen, working at ABC Corporation is amazing. They treat us well, they give us great benefits, they provide us with lots of positive feedback, they give us all the training and development we need. You should come work here, right? Your employees become one of the biggest advocates of working for the organization. So this is what I referred to at the beginning a little bit, the legal framework of human resource management in Canada, right? I'm just trying to make sure you can see the whole slide here. Okay, there we go. It's a bit better. Okay, so the legal framework of human resource management in Canada. HR manager has responsibility to avoid these two things: internal discrimination, and that's deliberately using prohibited grounds such as race, religion, sex when making employee decisions. You are not allowed to take any of those things into consideration when making decisions in the HR department. And then sometimes it's unintentional, unfair practices or policies that have an adverse impact on specific groups that are unrelated to the job. So these are things that maybe HR departments are doing that are really unfair, and they really disadvantage a certain section or portion of the population. Even two types of legislation that have been created in order to prevent discrimination within the workplace. One is called the Employment Standards Act, and the other one is the Canadian Human Rights Act. And I love this quote. It says, "How you treat your employees is how you expect them to treat the customer," right? If the people that are working for you feel empowered, they feel excited to be there, they feel like they are engaged, they're going to treat the people who come through the business very well. But if they feel the opposite, they feel beat up and they feel like they have no voice and that maybe they're being discriminated against, they're not going to, put on that friendly face when people come into your business, which is so critical to the success. So it's really important. Not only is it important to treat people fairly and humanely just because it is the right thing to do, but it's even bad for business if you're treating your people unfairly, because they're going to be miserable, and you don't want people walking into your organization and people there not being happy. Okay, so the legal framework of human resource management in Canada. Here is the Employment Standards Act. Here are a couple things that they deal with. So this act outlines some minimum standards for the private sector in the federal, provincial, and territory legislation. It deals with things like minimum age for employment. You need to be of a certain age in Canada to work. You need to make sure that you control the number of hours that people work. You can't have them working additional hours over a maximum, and if you do, they deserve overtime pay. You have to pay them according to minimum wage laws. You have to pay them equally between each other. They have to make sure that they have some rest during the week, that they're given general holidays with pay and annual vacations with pay, that they're entitled to parental leave and individual and group terminations and mandatory retirement and whistleblowing protection. So all of these are some of the items this Employment Standards Act outlines. And one of the great reasons it is so good to work here in Canada, because there's lots of countries around the world that don't have these standards in place, and your rights as an employee are very few and far in between. But here in Canada, those rights are protected. So the second component we talked about is the Canadian Human Rights Act. So it covers all businesses under federal jurisdiction. Each province and territory has its own human rights legislation. So it's really interesting that there's an overarching Canadian human rights, but then each province has their own human rights legislation. All jurisdictions prohibit discrimination based on the grounds of race, color, religion, physical, mental disability, sex, marital status, and age. It is illegal to discriminate on any of these items in Canada. Okay, I thought this was really interesting, this figure 7.2, because when I say the word diversity to you, there's certain images that pop up in your head, right? But really, it is a much broader definition than I think most of us are used to, right? Diversity is difference among people in age, gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and sexual orientation, right? That's what we normally think of. But what's so interesting about this diagram is you can see there's diversity on a number of different levels, right? You have organizational diversity on the outer rim of this diagram. So depending on seniority, work location, are you part of a union, the management status, that there's a diversity within that. The second one is external dimensions of diversity. So geographic location, income, personal habits, religion, educational backgrounds. And then the one I think that we are most highly attuned to, that we hear the most of, are these internal dimensions, right? What is someone's age? What is their sexual orientation? What is their race? What is their ethnicity? What is their gender? How do they identify? We're used to all of those types of diversity, but what we don't often take into account are these external and organizational dimensions. So diversity is a very broad term that encompasses far more than just gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, right? There's all these other components that contribute to diversity. And as a manager, as a human resource manager, you have to be aware that the scope of diversity goes far beyond just these things that we can see with our eyes, right? So managing a diverse workforce. Future success depends on addressing barriers to more fulsome participation. Why is diversity a pressing issue? Effectively managing diversity can improve organizational effectiveness. Of course it can. Embracing diversity encourages employees to engage and thus differs in opinions and ideas, and strong ethics are imperative that all employees receive equal opportunities and are treated fairly and justly. If you want a harmonious organization, if you want a company that is thriving, you have to make sure that you engage diversity and that you celebrate it and that you understand the strengths. With diversity comes varying opinions, comes creativity, comes the richness of what an organization could be, right? Who wants to work with an organization with one type of person that's all the same? The beautiful part about the opportunity to work with so many organizations in Canada is that you are exposed to all this diversity that allows you to grow as an individual, to expand your mind, and really to experience various different perspectives and backgrounds and all the rest of it. It's super exciting if you get to work in an organization that has a diverse workforce. Absolutely. Okay, on to the next topic. Human resources takes a lot of planning, right? This is something that has to be proactive. You can't be a good human resource manager and simply engage in your job every time a position needs to be filled. There has to be a lot of planning that goes up to it. So when a vacancy comes up, or the company expands or changes or grows, that you are ready when that happens. So human resource planning are activities managers use to forecast current and future needs. You need to be a couple of months, maybe years ahead and say, okay, we need this type of position 6 months from now, so I'm going to start looking now. Workforce planning is analyzing the gap in the current and future needs and developing strategies to meet needs and implementing and evaluating that strategy, right? So human resource planning and workforce planning are a huge part of the human resource department. So they must be done prior to recruiting and selection, as I said, and there's two types of forecasts. Demand forecasts estimate the qualifications and the number of employees an organization will need, and supply forecasts estimate the availability and the qualifications of current employees now and in the future in those external labor markets, right? So we're running into this when you can think of some fields in Canada. We don't have enough people employed with the proper qualifications and skills, so there's not enough supply to meet the demand. So we need doctors, we need nurses, we need people in the trades. There's all sorts of industries that we don't have enough supply. So what the government is doing is they're throwing all sorts of incentives to encourage people to go to school and study these things. And they're also looking at immigration and saying, okay, listen, we need these types of professions in our society, so maybe we tailor the immigration a bit to help us meet those supply forecasts over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years here. This is a really interesting figure. So this is the planning cycle. This gives you an idea of how much goes into planning in the human resource department. So if you want to start up in the left-hand corner, to monitor and evaluate. And what's really interesting is each different colored arrow, you can see the colored box, right? So when you're going from monitor and evaluate to workforce analysis, you can see that that blue arrow, what's happening there, what is the activity to move to workforce analysis, is they analyze the workforce against organizational direction, internal workforce characteristics, capabilities, and external labor market, right? And then as you move from workforce analysis to forecast future needs, future businesses need scenarios, you're running characteristics and see what capabilities are identified. From there, you're moving to the analyzation or analyze gaps. So what are the gaps between what you need and what's happening? Then you're going to go over to development strategies at the bottom there, up to implementing the strategies and back to monitoring. So this is another cycle, right, where you're continually doing this. You're continually trying to say, okay, what are going to be our workforce needs? You have to do an analysis, you have to forecast what you need, you have to analyze where the gaps are, and then you have to develop strategies and implement them to try to continually have the people that you need. And you can imagine if you work for a large organization with thousands of employees, how daunting this could be, because you might need to hire 100 people in a field to work in some sort of specialization. Like if you think of just outside of Barrie, they manufacture cars at Honda in Alliston, and the thousands of people that work there, you need all sorts of skills. People driving the trucks, people testing the cars, people putting the cars together, people to deal with the computer systems. And they're always running this cycle to figure out what are they going to need down the line. And are there enough people trained to work in those fields, right? Human resource planning. So this is really interesting. The idea of outsourcing the human resource planning. So you take maybe a big part of this cycle or maybe a portion of the cycle, and you outsource it. You say, listen, this is such a huge job. There are specific companies that do this type of work and take it off the plate of the organization. So what is outsourcing? It's using outside supplies and manufacturers to produce goods and services. And there's two reasons for outsourcing. One is increases the flexibility, especially when forecasting human resource needs. It's difficult, it's fluctuating, and it's difficult to find, right? So this is like a full-time job for a large number of people. And so if you have an organization that might be able to take over this, it really takes some stuff off your plate so you can do other things. The second reason is it lowers the cost of the organization. There's no benefits for the employees, extend contracts only when work is needed, and no investment in training. So you really save on having to have all these positions internally, right? You can outsource that to another organization. There are some advantages and there are some disadvantages. And they use two examples here. The first one was computer software companies outsourcing programming to Canada or to India. And this happens all the time, especially in Canada and the United States. They can find people in India, they can find them in Eastern Europe, they can find them maybe in Africa and South America, places where they don't have to pay people as much because people in that local environment aren't paid Canadian salaries. They're paid far less because in some situations they can live on less, in other situations that's what the market demands. So some advantages, like I said, takes advantage of lower labor costs, provides flexibility by allowing the company to focus on other competencies, and reduce costs when the company outsources, right? Mostly financial. But this is the disadvantage. If you go to the other column there, you lose control out of the quality of services, right? That person in India or in, like I said, in Eastern Europe or Africa, you're not overlooking what they're doing every day. So you really might have to accept a lower quality of work. Companies hired to do the work have less knowledge. Yeah, they're not at the organization. They don't know how things work there. They don't know the procedures or goals. They're having to do a lot of it blind. And then outsourced employees have less commitment, to the organization, right? They don't have that engagement piece that we talked about is so important. They're just banging away on a computer screen, right? They have nothing really invested. And the potential to eliminate members of the job creates resistance to outsource. Yeah, so this is the other thing that's scary, is that once positions start to be outsourced, you're looking around the organization thinking, "Oh my gosh, am I next? Am I going to be outsourced here to a different to someone who takes my job from another country?" Which is a real possibility. It's happening, and it makes sense why it's happening, because these businesses are in business to make money, and if they can save hundreds of thousands of dollars in salaries, then they're going to do that. Okay, job analysis. This is planning that is critical to retaining job knowledge. So what they're trying to do is figure out, as people retire, maybe they move on, maybe they have a certain percentage of people that end up seeking other jobs a year. So they punch all of these kind of numbers into a chart or some way to organize it, and they say, how are we going to plan for when people leave our organization? So personal replacement charts are graphic illustrations of current positions, who holds them, and whether they have the skill or qualifications necessary for succession planning, which means moving up to the next position. So are the people who are junior managers, do they have the skill to move up to senior management? And do those senior managements have the skills to move up to maybe a vice president, a CEO, COO, whatever the next kind of rung up the ladder is. And then job analysis is identifying the tasks, duties, and responsibilities that make up a job. For example, a job description, and the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform the job, which is the job specifications. And it can be completed through observations or questionnaires or a number of other ways. So this is really taking a look at what jobs are available now and what is going to be available in the future, and do we have enough people to either hire or train to fill those positions. So advantages and disadvantages to outsourcing human resources. Oh, we did this. So my fault. We're going back to here. This is the chart that applies to that. So here's the job analysis, and like I said, they plug it into a graphic illustration. This is what one of those graphic illustrations look like. So what they've done is they've listed Vice President of Finance, Vice President of Operations, Vice President of Marketing, and then they've plugged individuals into a chart, and they've rated their performance, right? Are they excellent, satisfactory, or do they need improvement? And then do they have the potential to be promoted, right? And if they don't, then they might need to scramble and hire someone externally. But this is a big part of the human resource department, is the succession planning for future needs. It's not even a need today, but if this happens in the next week or months or years, we need to be ready to fill those positions. And if we don't have it, right, internally, this is what it goes to: recruitment, right? You have to get out there and you have to recruit those people. So recruitment are activities that managers use to develop a pool of qualified candidates for open positions. So external recruiting, looking outside the organization, and you do it through, maybe you do it through newspapers, but most of this is online now, LinkedIn and Indeed and all those websites that advertise positions that are open. Open houses, career fairs, and like I was saying, job sites. And then internal, right? You just look internally. Maybe you don't have to go outside and hire someone. And that's what this chart is. This is an internal chart, right? This is people who work inside the organization. This is an example of internal recruiting. You're trying to see if white, pink, blue, or black, or gray, or rose are good to fill the positions of Vice President of Finance and Operations. You aren't going externally to find that. So internal recruiting, turning the existing employees to fill open positions, like I said, and sometimes it's a lateral move, job changes that entail no major changes in responsibility or authority levels. So maybe you want to be, you go from being the manager of finances to the manager of human resources, and it's a lateral move. Like you're not really changing much in terms of your level of responsibility. Or authority. It's just a different set of maybe job specifications. Okay, so sources of recruitment, we talked about this a little bit. The internal sources are transfers, promotions, upgrading, people retiring, ex-employees, relatives of disabled employees, and then external sources are maybe a referral, an advertisement, employee exchanges, recruiting on campuses, placement agencies, right? Hiring agencies to place people, irregular applications, and database search on websites. Okay, so we'll break this down a little bit further to the advantages and disadvantages for both external and internal recruitment. So let's start on the left-hand side here with external recruitment. So there's a number of advantages. You have a massive labor pool, right? Almost anyone can apply to a job. The newcomers that arrive at the organization have fresh ideas and a lot of energy and tend to have up-to-date knowledge, right? You're not going to hire someone who is not on the top of their game. Some disadvantages is that you might, hurt the morale of the organization by bypassing someone who is excited about getting a promotion. You have to train the people, so it's going to take them a few months to get up to speed. And then you're not sure how someone's going to perform until they're actually in the job, right? They might look great on paper, but then after a couple of months, you realize, listen, this isn't the best person for the job. So internal recruitment, there are a number of advantages here. So promotions or lateral moves boost level of motivation and morale. Candidates are already familiar with the organization, so you don't need all that orientation and training. And managers know their skill level and their ability and how they behave. There's no guesswork there. On the other side, it is a limited pool because you're hiring within the organization. Set in the organization's existing ways, so they really don't want to train and bring new ideas. They're comfortable with the way things are, and they want to keep them that way. And use existing and old technologies, so they're not really bringing any type of new skill set. They know what they know because they've learned it from the organization. So that organization doesn't really move too far forward unless you retrain the individual that comes internally. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both, and a lot of it's going to be situational depending on the position in the organization, and in the skill set and the diversity of the pool of candidates you have. Okay, so there is a selection process, right? And it varies for every organization. It might be a much different selection process to work for Tim Hortons than it would be for Honda or for Google, right? Like there's certain levels of scrutiny depending on what organization that you're applying for. So the selection tools, whatever they are, they must be valid and they must be reliable. So valid selection technique, a test or a tool that measures the candidate's likeliness to succeed or fail in performing the job, and reliable, so yields consistent results when repeated over and over, right? So if you do it multiple times, you have to make sure that the results are reliable between people that you are testing. So this is an interesting diagram, right? Because that's selection in the middle, and then on the outside there's those 4 boxes. You do your background check and your reference checks. You do some interviews, maybe in even some jobs you do some sort of performance simulation tests, and for other jobs there's written tests, right? And it all depends on the organization. So for some organizations you wouldn't have to go through this much of a process, but for other ones you absolutely would be, because it's so important to have a highly skilled, motivated employee. Okay, a little bit about the selection process. And again, this is going to be different and tailored for every organization. It's not always going to follow these steps, but various techniques that I'm going to go through may apply to every job. So with almost any job you have, there's some background information and reference checks, right? This is why you spend so much time working on that resume, because this is the first step. You're not going to get into an interview until they've checked your background and maybe you called a couple references and said, is it worth my time to interview this person? So once you get past that initial background information reference check, you go on to step two, right? Step two is a structured interview. And these are standard questions that are asked in a certain sequence and they're evaluated based on predetermined answers. They're going to ask you a question, they're going to have the answer written down, and they're going to see how well your answer lines up with what their standard answer is or what they want to see or hear. And then the second one is an unstructured interview. It's an unplanned question asked as points of interest arise in the conversation. And these are more laid back where they know, listen, you got the background, you've answered a couple of structural questions, we're pretty good with the with your skills and we're great with your background. Now, here come the unstructured questions, a little bit about maybe the culture, how the company operates, some things that are not as tangible, and those are more unstructured. Where do you see yourself in 5 years isn't really a question you'd ask someone and have a standard answer to, but it's really interesting to hear the answer. So there's three types of interview questions. One is situational, and they ask candidates how they would deal with a specific situation in the future. So if this arose, how would you handle it working in this organization? The second one is behavioral. So you ask candidates to describe how they reacted to specific situations in the past. And then there's work requirement questions. And this assesses the candidate's willingness to perform under prevailing job conditions. So, you know, we work 5 days a week here. We normally get to the office at 8 a.m. We leave around 4:30. You know, that's a requirement of the job. Are you willing to do that? Does that work for you? And then the situational and behavioral will all depend on the type of job you're applying for. So examples of interview question types, we talked about this. There's a situational one. Here's a couple of examples. So an example of a situational interview question would be, how would you deal with an irate customer? What would you do if you had to persuade someone to change their opinion? Behavioral type questions like describe a situation in which you successfully dealt with a conflict. Tell me a little bit about a situation in which you had to persuade someone to influence someone's opinion. And then the work requirement ones, you know, sometimes we have customers complaining about the slow service. How do you feel about working in a hostile environment? Like, you got to take some flack sometimes from customers. Are you going to be okay with that? Like, do you understand that sometimes people will be frustrated? You'll be asked to mitigate customer complaints. Are you willing to handle the stress of trying to talk people off the ledge when they're angry about something? Okay, a bit more about the selection process. So now that we've done the background check, we've done a little bit about the interviewing. Then in some organizations, you have tests. Sometimes these tests come before the interview. You know, for example, if you want to get into law enforcement, if you want to go into be a doctor, if you want to be a lawyer, there's tests that come before even applying for jobs. So it depends on the type of job, but there's absolutely situations where you might have to have a job after the interview. My brother once was telling me he was interviewing for a job in Toronto, and they gave him a marker and there was a whiteboard and they wanted to work out a math problem. So sometimes these even happen in interviews. Okay, so there's two types of written tests. The first one is an ability test, and that assesses the extent to which applicants possess skills necessary for the job performance. And then there's personality tests, and I've taken a couple of these during my professional career, and they measure your personality traits and characteristics to see, is this person going to be a good fit? Is their personality kind of line up with what we have going on in this organization? Do they value what we value? Are they interested in what we're interested in? There are physical ability tests, like I said, law enforcement, firefighting, all that kind of stuff. Might measure your physical strength and stamina, anything to do with the military. And then performance simulation tests, measure job applicants' performance on the actual job, right? They might put you in a simulation and say, how do they perform when they're dealing with maybe an irate customer. So this is a typical steps of the hiring process. Like I said, It doesn't always happen in this order, but a lot of times it follows this type of sequence. So the pre-screen, right, the background, the initial interview, they do some testing, background reference checking, and then once all of that checks the boxes, they have the final interview. I mean, I've had jobs where I had 3 or 4 interviews and panel discussions and all the rest of it before I actually got to the final interview. So especially for leadership stuff, for management things, those might take a couple more steps than an entry level job. So training and development. So once they have you hired, you're in the organization, they say, great, you show up your first day, you're going to have to go through an orientation. And really that's an introduction to the culture, norms, policies, value, vision, and mission of the organization. What is it all about? You're going to get into some technical training that teaches you how the organizational members perform their current jobs and acquire some maybe new skills and knowledge. Development builds workers' knowledge and skills maybe on an ongoing basis, right? You might have some professional development quarterly or monthly or yearly. And then a needs assessment determines which employees need training or development and what types of skills or knowledge need to be acquired, right? This was a huge thing when COVID hit, right? Because when COVID hit and everyone had to stay home, there was a whole bunch of new training and development and this needs assessment analysis to figure out, okay, what do we need to have in place to ensure people can work from home and still get the job done, right? So this is an ongoing challenge. Oh, and here are a number of different ways that that can be delivered. And I'm sure that you've received certainly an education in various different formats, but training has also done that. Sometimes it's done online using video conferencing. Sometimes it's e-learning using interactive simulations. On the job training, right? You do it right there. Mentoring, you're working with someone in the organization that has a bit more experience than you. And then diversity training using films and focus groups and forums to uncover biases and stereotypes and maybe some systematic racism within the organization. So training comes in all different shapes and sizes. And then once you've done the training, you're kind of on the job, you know what you're doing. There's performance appraisals and feedback where you can learn where there's opportunities to grow, where you can learn about what you're doing well and continue doing that. And infrequently or very rarely, I think it gets to the point where if someone's not doing their job, they're not performing well, then they start maybe moving down the track of letting somebody go, right? So performance appraisal is an evaluation of employees' job performance, and it contributes to the organization. Performance feedback is a process through which managers share performance appraisal information with subordinates, so people they're managing, and they give subordinates the opportunity to reflect on their own performance and develop with subordinates a plan for the future. So listen, Kelly, you're great at your job, but I feel like when employees when customers are complaining and they're getting irate, you get frustrated too easily. Let's work on some ways to make sure that you can mitigate your frustration and deal with it more effectively. Like that's a performance critique, right? And they contribute to effective management in 2 ways: important information on which to base HR decisions, right? That whole succession planning, right? Identifying people that are going to do well, and encourages high levels of employees' motivation and performance, right? If you know that you are being essentially graded, you're going to perform a bit better. And if you get positive feedback, it encourages you and motivates you to continue to perform well, to continue to really, kind of knock the ball out of the park type thing. Okay, so there's various different types of performance appraisals, and there's whole courses about how to deal with appraising employees, but we're going to give you just a brief overview of a couple ways in which employees can be appraised. So the first one is trait appraisals, and they assess subordinates on personal characteristics relevant to job performance. Behavioral appraisals assess how employees perform their jobs, actual actions and behaviors they exhibit on the job. Graphic rating scale method scores employees on specific characteristics that reflect performance levels. And then results, right? Results appraisals performed by the result or the actual outcome of the work behavior. If you're in sales and you work in an organization and you don't have any sales, it's pretty easy to give that person a results appraisal, right? There's no results. Things are not happening. Here's an example of a graphic rating scale. I'm not going to go through all the factors in the rating, but you can see how if you were a manager, how you would rate an employee based on these factors. It's essentially like a rubric, right? Like something you would be marked when you hand in a paper. There's certain criteria. How well do you meet those criteria? And you get a score at the end. Who appraises the performance? So this is really interesting. So sometimes, and we've talked about this a lot, it's a manager appraising the subordinates, right? It's the manager in charge appraising the performance, the behavior, the results of the employees. But this is more of it like a 360-degree appraisal, because you can get appraisals from supervisors. You can get it from customers or clients that give feedback. You can get it from people you manage, like how do I manage? Am I managing well? Do I need to improve? You can do it yourself. You can see if it's a results type job and are you getting the results or aren't you? And then you have peers, right? People that work alongside you that can appraise you. So sometimes you can get information about appraisals from various different sources. So this is what I refer to, a 360-degree performance appraisal provides appraisals from a variety of people in a position to evaluate the manager's performance, from peers, subordinates, superiors, clients, customers. You can really gather a rich amount of information from a variety of sources when you're looking to improve. It doesn't have to be just the person who manages you. So what is effective performance feedback, right? Like you want the feedback you give people to be effective. You don't want it to fall on deaf ears. You don't want it to discourage them. You want it to be a process in which they can hear the information and then be excited about improving on their performance and doing better in the future. So managers must provide their supporters with performance feedback. So there's formal and informal. So formal appraisals are conducted at set times of the year based on predetermined performance dimensions and measures. So we're going to call you in every quarter and we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about your performance. Or it could be informal, and that's unscheduled appraisals of ongoing progress and areas of improvement, right? If a manager witnesses something you do well, they pull you aside and said, listen, I really like how you handled that customer. You're just doing such a great job. Or the opposite, if I were to deal with that situation again, how might you do it differently? Or maybe you tweak this part or that part of your conversation. I think you're going to get a better result in the end, right? That's an informal appraisal. It's always important to keep in mind why we're giving feedback, right? Why are we doing this? So help determine how to distribute pay raises and bonuses, who to reward, and to encourage high level of motivation and performance. And I think another key here is what we talked about before, this whole succession planning, to know who has the characteristics and ability to maybe move up to that next level within the organization. So, effective performance feedback, guidelines for giving effective performance. Be specific and focused on behaviors or outcomes that are correctable and within the worker's ability to improve, right? You want to give them something that they can actually improve and be better at, right? You want to make sure it's very specific, right? Give them a detailed item that they can improve on, not some sort of great job type feedback. You need to tell them what specifically they did a great job in and why it was so effective. Focus on problem solving and solution finding, not criticizing. Yeah, don't go up to someone and say, listen, you're doing a terrible job, do better, right? You might go up and say, like the example I gave earlier, maybe the next time that employee comes in and is irate about something and you're the manager, instead of arguing with them, maybe just listen for the first 10 minutes, right? That's something that is a problem solving or solution finding piece of information. I'm not just simply criticizing the person. Express confidence in the worker's ability to improve. Yeah, say, listen, I think you're doing a great job and you're going to improve in this area. You're going to be even better. So I have all the confidence that you can make a tweak here and be even better next week and next month and so on and so forth. Provide performance feedback both formally and informally. We talked about the difference between those two in the previous slide. Praise incidences of high performance in areas of the job in which employees excel. Avoid personal criticism, of course, and treat subordinates with respect. Yeah, you never, this is a tip I'll give you. Never criticize people in public, right? Never be the type of manager that calls out somebody in front of other people. And the flip side of it, you should always praise in public. I've learned from a couple good leaders I've worked with that if you're doing a good job, they say it loud enough for other people to hear because it really makes you feel better and encourages everyone to do a better job. And agree to a timetable for performance improvements. Say, yeah, listen, you're not really excelling in this area. I'll give you some tips, maybe some additional training, and I'm expecting by next quarter that you've really upped your game in this area, right? Give them an idea of what type of time frame they have to make those improvements. Moving on to pay and benefits. Listen, it is really interesting to get an appreciation of how broad human resources is, right? Because we've spent the majority of the time talking about how to recruit people, how to retain people, how to train them, how to make sure that they're performing well, how to plan ahead for who you're going to need, how to follow all the laws and the requirements to make sure that people are treated fairly, that you're not being biased, that you're embracing diversity. But then on top of that, you have to worry about paying people and making sure that they have benefits, right? So pay includes base salaries, pay raises, and bonuses, right? Determined by the characteristics of an organization and the job. Normally they have a chart. They say you have so many years of performance. You're going to be, starting at this base salary, and over the next 5 years, this is where you're going to move up the chart. The benefits, on the other hand, you have from day one. And these are things like sick days, vacation days, medical, and life insurance, and based on the membership in an organization. And sometimes maybe the longer you're with an organization, the more benefits you have. But it's a big thing here in Canada, especially if you have a job with benefits, because unlike places in the States, there's very few organizations that have benefits that really cover you being sick or various types of insurance that you may need. So pay level, and this is what I referred to in the chart. So pay level is how an organization pays incentives compared to other firms in the industry, employing similar kinds of workers. Managers must decide to offer relatively low, average, or high wages, right? What type of employee do you want to attract, and how much money do you have to do it? Pay structure are clusters of jobs into categories based on relative importance to an organization's goals and levels of skills required, right? If you have someone in an organization, we'll use Honda, for example, who's on the floor putting cars together, they're not going to be paid at the same pay structure as someone who is a manager or someone who's a vice president or who operates Honda Canada or Honda worldwide, right? Those are different types of jobs, and there's going to be different pay levels because of how important those jobs are. If you screw up making a car on the line, they can stop the line, they can fix the part that you screwed up on. But if you make a mistake and you're on the upper management and it has to do with the production line, generally that's a bigger mistake. So you want to make sure that people are rewarded and paid according to the number of the amount of responsibility they have and how difficult their job is to do. So benefits, mandatory benefits vary across provinces. Organizations required to pay into workers' compensation, social insurance, and employment insurance. At their discretion, employees provide additional benefits. These are things like extended health insurance, dental, vacation time, pension plans, life insurance, flexible work hours, company-provided daycare, employee assistance, and wellness programs, and on and on and on. So depending on the type of job you have, there'll be various different types of benefits according to the level you are in that organization and maybe the type of field you're in. And then there's something called cafeteria style benefit plans, and they allow employees to choose the best mix of benefits. So I've worked at Georgian College for a number of years. This is one of the benefits there is they have a cafeteria style benefit plan. So I can choose the benefits that I want to pay into, and I don't have to pay into all of them if I don't want them, but I could also choose to have more benefits, right? It's an interesting diagram down here or photo. They have They have people that are the employees, and then you can see the CEO pay. And what that is an indication of is that in proportion to the salaries being paid out in organizations, generally CEOs have the lion's share of that pay. So they get paid proportionately more than the average employee. I forget the numbers, but off the top of my head, it's like a CEO can make 100 times the amount that someone at the lowest level receives. So there's a lot of criticism about the levels of pay we do for certain CEOs, but some organizations have millions of dollars at stake. So some people say that they've earned it. So we talked about employee engagement at the beginning here. So employee engagement are activities managers engage in to ensure that there's fair and consistent treatment of all employees, right? And that that's maintained. So it requires cooperation between management and HR. Employees' attitude surveys, right? You're saying, okay, let's send out an anonymous survey every once in a while to make sure that the employees are engaged, they like what they're doing, what are areas that we can improve and make their job maybe a bit easier. And there's something called employee assistance programs, and they help employees cope with potential personal issues that interfere with their job performance. So labor relations is really interesting. So labor relations is like unionized, like organized um, groups that help protect the rights of these employees. So labor relations are activities managers engage in to ensure an effective working relationship with labor unions that represent their employees' interests. So in Canada, it was something like 40% of government jobs are unionized, and then in the States it's like 10 or 12%. So we have many more unions here in Canada that are helping to protect the rights of the employees than in the States. So laws dealing with unethical and unfair treatment of workers, the Canadian Labor Code, the Canadian Human Rights and Provincial Employment Standards. So this is how the process works, right? A group of employees get together and they have a desire to unionize. They campaign for certification, recognition by the employer and the labor relations board, right? So a labor is formed or a union is formed. There's collective bargaining, and that is, whenever you see teachers go on strike, for example, there's collective bargaining to try to figure out what is fair and what is equitable. They come to an agreement. And then there's the administration of the collective agreement. There was one a few years ago at Georgian, and it was about equality of pay and benefits, vacation time, and a bunch of other stuff. And so the union got together. They walked out on work for a couple days or weeks. I forget what it was. Then they came together. They did a bit of bargaining back and forth. They came to an agreement, and then the agreement was administered throughout the college. Okay, so what is collective bargaining? So collective bargaining is negotiations between the labor union and their employee, and they take place to arrive at a mutually acceptable, that's what they call the collective agreement, set of provisions that govern the working conditions between the union and the employer for a set period of time. Oh, here we go. Trends in labor relations. So I found this really interesting when I was reading the chapter here. So in 2015, total workers paying union dues was 4,830,000. In Canada, approximately 40% of public workers are unionized, and in the States, it's only 7. Right? Impact of labor relations is significant. HR departments expands to include a labor relations specialist. Managers lose decision-making power as union leaders increase participation in issues affecting their members. Reward power is least as pay levels or is lessened as pay levels and pay structures are set out in terms of a collective agreement, and HR managers keep paper records of employee assignments and behaviors, as this is crucial at a grievance and arbitration hearing. So everything has to be super tight and transparent when there's a union to deal with, because if they're not following the rules, the union is going to come down on the management. Okay, so this has become even, like, listen, more and more prevalent in the last few years. People are speaking up about workplace harassment, and it seems like every few weeks there's a new case in the news about someone who's coming out about being abused here. So workplace harassment is any behavior directed towards an employee that is known to be or ought to be known to be offensive or unwelcome. And there's two common forms, right? These aren't the only forms, but there are two common forms. One is abuse of authority, when legitimate power is vested in a position, is used improperly to influence people's behaviors. So you're being a little bit of a bully, that you're intimidating people, that you are treating them unfairly. And the second one is sexual harassment, unwelcome behavior of a sexual nature that negatively affects the work environment or leads to adverse job relation consequences. So two types of harassment in the workplace. Forms of sexual harassment: quid pro quo sexual harassment is asking or forcing an employee to perform sexual favors in exchange for some sort of reward or to avoid not negative consequences. You're going to go out with a date on me, and if not, then I'm not going to promote you. Hostile work environment, sexual harassment. Employees are faced with an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment because of their gender. There could be lewd jokes, so inappropriate jokes, sexually oriented comments, displays of pornography, sexually oriented remarks, remarking about someone's physical appearance, and on and on and on, right? There's often training now in various organizations about the way that you can make sure that people don't feel like they're being either intimidated or sexually harassed, right? Where in North America, in Western society, if you watch old films or old movies, you can see this type of behavior going on all the time, and it was just normal. But now I'm hoping that we've got to this place that we're a bit more enlightened, we're a bit more sensitive, and we understand that there are very clear boundaries that you do not cross in a work environment, in a school environment, any type of professional atmosphere, as well as, listen, even in social situations, right? Okay, steps managers can take to eradicate workplace harassment. So here are some steps. Again, depending on the organization, it may differ, but here are 4 initial steps that you can take. Develop and clearly communicate a workplace harassment policy and make sure that the top managers endorse it and say, yes, this is what we're doing, and we're going to follow it. And harassment has no place in our organization. Use a fair complaint procedure to investigate charges of sexual harassment. Yeah, make sure that if someone brings something up, it is thoroughly investigated and that you follow procedure. When it has been determined that harassment has taken place, take corrective actions as soon as possible. Yeah, if you feel that someone has committed sexual harassment, they need to be dealt with, and they need to be dealt with as soon as possible. Provide workplace harassment education and training for all employees, including managers. Like I said, this is a staple in any organization, that people have training and they become more educated about the prevalence of this in organizations. Okay, we made it. Here's a summary of what you should know for this chapter. So, human resource management legislation and managing diversity. So there's several key pieces of legislation. We talked about the Human Rights Act. We talked about employee standards. We talked about managing diversity and how if you want to be an effective organization that gains a competitive advantage, you want to make sure you engage all employees, and you do that in an ethically and sound way. Strategic human resource management. This is what we talked about, the various procedures and processes that you need to have, basically a system, a human resource management system that needs to be consistent. It needs to have very specific structure, and it needs to have goals. And then you need to have the human resource planning, right? You need to plan ahead. You need to have the charts and know what positions might become vacant and what types of people that will fill in. Based on their jobs analysis, right? What are the duties and tasks and responsibilities that make up the job, and what are the skills and knowledge, abilities that people need to perform those positions? Components, yeah, we talked about the 5 major components: recruitment and selection, training and development, performance appraisal, pay and benefits, and employee engagement. And then finally, harassment in the workplace. We talked about human resources managers and how they need to deal with unwanted behavior, right? It's not only you need to find the people, you need to train them, you need to hopefully retain them, but you also need to govern their behavior. And when employees are behaving in an offensive or abusive way, you need to make sure you deal with it. You deal with it by communicating anti-harassment policies and procedures and investigating complaints right away and taking corrective action to discipline people who might exhibit any type of harassment in the workplace. And you provide ongoing education so people understand where the lines are and not to cross them. And if they are crossed, what procedures and policies to follow to launch a complaint. Okay, so that is it. That is human resources. Um, I'm hoping it gives you a bit more insight into it. If it sparks some interest, maybe this is an area where you want to work one day. You think, oh, you know what, human resources is something that I really think is an interesting area. It's something that I'd like to maybe learn a bit more about or pursue. And maybe you end up being an HR manager or working in the human resources department in an organization. Okay, so that is it. If you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out and ask, and have yourself a great rest of the day.